What's up, all you lazy, entitled, basement-dwelling millennials, bootstrapping boomers, apathetic Xers, and goddamn Gen Z kids today? We are recording our third-ish, maybe, episode of the Let Them Eat Toast podcast here at On Tap Studios. We've got a guest. We've got Chris today at Fly Fast Planes.
How's it going, guys?
I'm a big fan of things with motors. If you follow me, you probably know. Chris flies things with motors, and apparently he had some interest in the bullshit I was rambling on about, while I had interest in the stuff he was trying not to crash. So we ended up connecting. We've had some really great barroom conversations, and we figured we'd subject you to that. Obviously, Taylor with me as always.
Howdy, guys.
And yeah, we're going to get this kicked off talking about unions, organized labor, minimum wage, just the things that make America tick, that keep getting taken away from us and making it harder for people to be successful today. And Chris is uniquely in a position to talk about this right now because he is a part of a union that is dealing with things that you might not think about when it comes to what unions deal with right now. So I think that will be some interesting conversation. So let's get started.
Indeed. So my name's Chris, Fly Fast Planes on the various
Talkies.
on the Tiki-Talkies, the Instagrams, and I really don't do much else, so don't expect anything out of me on that one. But I am a regional airline pilot. I am part of a union, and I think that being part of the 10% of Americans that are part of a union have made at least the wages at my position much better. And you can contrast that to the same regional pilots flying the same airplane, making $10,000 less a year with far worse quality of life, with substantially more difficult circumstances in a number of ways that you kind of forget that, like, hey, these guys and gals can get sent out at midnight, get told, hey, you're going to stand up for the next 5 hours at Pellston, Michigan, and then you're going to come back early in the morning. You're not going to go to a hotel room. You're just going to be up all night doing this and maybe getting to rest in the airplane, but you can't stay in the airport. You got to just basically camp out on your regional jet. It's not a quality thing. It is a thing called the continuous duty overnight that is still happening. We don't do that
Because of your union.
because of my union.
And it's worth pointing out that those people that are doing that are flying the plane that you might be getting on. So that person's been up all night.
Just truckers have like a rule, right? With like how many hours they can be on the job or driving, I guess, per se. I'm assuming that doesn't count like towards your flying time hours, that sort of standby time.
Mercifully, the FAA has instituted a thing called that 117 rules, and it does count. So they can't work the entire day before, stay up all night, and then work the whole next day or anything. Like there is a limited amount of time that they may be on duty, particularly when they stay up overnight, because they're understanding that when you stay up overnight, you are not fresh and you are not alert. And it turns out when things are happening at 500 miles an hour, those are kind of clutch things to have happen.
I would think so. Yeah. Well, I think you mentioned right at the beginning is just like the whole wages thing. And I think it's just like right up front, we should go out and say that if you're in a union, like it's almost guaranteed that you're going to be making more money than non-union workers in the same industry. It's like the one thing that you can say about unions pretty much, I think, across the United States is that no matter what you're going to put in, maybe you're, putting in $700 or, like Delta to put up there, those $700, you might have to pay that for a year, but you're probably going to end up getting $700 every single month that you are part of that union.
Yeah, so for the $10K I'm getting extra this year, I am paying $0 in fees because it's my first year.
Sure.
And then in the second year, I'm going to pay $1,600.50 and still make more than $10,000 second year compared to those.
Right.
Folks.
Not to mention all the additional benefits that are
And the real
provided.
value for me is that quality of life stuff. I'm not bouncing between three different types of airplanes. I'm not bouncing around between the CRJ 200, 700, 900. I'm on the 900 pretty much solely, and they can put me on the 700 once in a while.
Sure.
Much easier airplanes to fly, and
And consistency.
Yeah, that consistency matters for pilots. Practice matters.
So work-life balance is a big thing for you, and for I assume most union people.
100%. The ability to get those days off, and the fact that I work 12 days a month and still make a living wage. And a lot of people are like, must be nice. It is, and you can have it too.
Right.
But you got to do the work to have it.
It's always that must be nice, and it's like, yeah, it is nice, and that's not something that we should be criticizing other people for having. And I think that this is where we get a lot of
Propaganda, baby.
Yeah, propaganda with when we were doing a live earlier today, and somebody mentioned some of these auto workers that might be going on strike, they're making $60 an hour. Like what do they need more for? And it's like you can have that too, and you should support them getting more. It shouldn't be them or you thing, because it's not. They get more, you get more. That's the way it works.
There's really, like, other than working in a factory, like you could be working at Starbucks or at Target, and you could, I don't know if those are exactly one-to-one type jobs, but the like ratio of what sort of benefits you could gain, I'm sure, is very similar if you unionize, if you
remember,
create solidarity.
With pilots, it's pilots versus management. So I can jump to the other airlines, and it's pilots versus management, not pilots versus pilots, and it should be the same. Workers for workers.
Right. No, exactly. I was researching some for this, and I did try to watch a few videos and few influencers who are against unions, and one of their biggest things was like it creates this like dynamic between management and workers that's like combative. And I'm thinking to myself, first of all, that's already there, man. Like if they tell you come to work and you don't want to go to work on that weekend day, they could just let you go, and then you have to find another job. The combative relationship already exists today. You might as well like just exist in that same environment, but get a little bit more benefits from it.
Well, and it's funny you say that too, because that combativeness is what they're saying. What the quiet part they're not saying out loud, or the quiet part they are saying out loud, is it's combative because the workers aren't being subservient to their overlords at that point. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like you aren't doing what the slave master tells you to do. That's combative. You should just shut up and go to work and be happy with your pittance.
Yeah.
And that's really what they're saying, is like that collective bargaining that gives you those abilities to have more, to have a better wage, to have a better quality of life. But then it's not just about the direct benefits that you get as a worker, that you get as a pilot. It's also about, again, safety things. The fact that I am safer flying with you because you're part of a union, and that's where I think one of the things your union is fighting for right now.
Yeah, they are fighting for better working conditions. They're fighting for staying at hotels is a big deal. Staying at good hotels where you get the appropriate rest, where they have good beds, where they are not super loud each night, where there's not a party happening, but where you can still walk and get food. That's hard to do. Mm-hmm. And that is a lot of back and forth communication with the company to make it happen. Mm-hmm. It's a lot better, though, when you do it through the union, because the union has the ability to say, hey, these aren't working. They were able to put the mechanisms in place to give feedback to the company, so that way when change is necessary, change happens. It just doesn't go, well, we looked at it, and this one cost us $68 a night, and that one that costs $72 a night is not worth the $4 extra times 4 for the entire crew.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure.
And now unions, I'm sure you saw a bunch more. I mean, there's a lot of propaganda against unions at this point.
I mean, the fact that that union membership has fallen from, I thought it was like 30% at its height in the 60s to 10% now, which is crazy considering union sentiment has not dropped.
No.
It's basically been in the 70s to 80% since 1960 or back in the height of union. So it's clearly there's something going on, a collective movement against union membership that is not just in a particular industry.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think kind of fed that into, I guess, the sentiment in the zeitgeist now of people thinking that? Like, do you think they were contributing factors?
That's a tough question. Yeah, no. I mean, I think it stems from the issues with capitalism, honestly, with corporations gaining more power, and then it's sort of like a death spiral of once they get power, they'll just get a little bit more, and it just begins harder and harder to push back against that. And especially with our government sort of enabling capitalism and corporations to just continue to degrade workplaces and pay, and obviously just like swiping cola away from auto workers and then saying, we'll probably bring it back if you just work hard for us. Yeah. And there's no accountability for anything, even as small as that or larger than that, in workplace safety. Like, well, and it's crazy.
I think that's an important thing, is getting that more power also comes with lobbying power that pressures the government to do things that are not pro-union. And we just saw this, with the Biden administration siding with the railroads against railroad workers.
Our most pro-union president.
Yeah, most
to
pro.
date. So he says. I don't know.
Self-proclaimed.
Yeah.
Self-proclaimed. Yes, there's a lot of self-proclaiming around presidents these days. It seems.
and that kind of stuff. Then obviously that sets a precedent that. All right, you go back to work. You don't get what you were. You don't get any of what you were working for. You've lost your right. Your collective bargaining power's strongest lever, which is striking.
Right. That's the hammer, right?
Yeah.
The hammer. It's like.
There has to be a bad cop here.
Right.
And that is what withholding your labor is.
Right. Exactly.
And so I think it's been that, and it really, because everything's Reagan's fault.
Well, right.
Everything's
I mean,
Reagan's fault.
we can go into the science of why exactly, but it started obviously with the air traffic controllers, somewhat related to your own situation right now.
Oh yeah. With not that unions had been they had kind of started eroding away 10 years earlier.
Yeah.
But then by that
Yeah.
point, Reagan felt he could push an advantage, and Jordan's point, there were thousands of strikes a year in the decade leading up.
Yeah, it was
to
an
the
average
80s.
of, I think, 300 strikes a year before the air traffic controller strike. And then after Reagan busted that, it has been an average of 30 strikes a year. It was like, that is an exponential
Right.
decrease in the amount of
That's pretty incredible.
labor action.
It's an order of magnitude worse, and
Right.
that's factor of 10 is a big deal.
Absolutely.
And then you look at the numbers. You look at how minimum wage increased every so many years prior to that, and then just stopped. We haven't had a minimum wage increase in a decade and a half now, over a decade and a half. You look at just wage stagnation across the board. You look at paid time off and benefits. You look at we've lost pensions. All of this, it can directly be tied to the time that unions really lost their collective power, bargaining power, their ability to influence the global or the national economy and the national job market.
Well,
with
right. That's
what we have now, which is not much.
Unions are powerful labor movements, and labor is the 95% of Americans, 90% of Americans.
Yeah.
And so when 90% of Americans lose a bargaining chip for the work, they spend a third of the day at minimum, 4 or 5 days a week, then we're going to lose. And clearly we've lost a lot. People are always talking about how wages are stagnating and how their money doesn't go as far these days. And this is a huge part of it. It's irrefutable how wages have not kept up with the cost of living. You can't even argue it.
Moreover, wages haven't kept up with productivity. So
Well, right,
the
there's that.
the profitability
There's that.
on that worker is still there, and they are not getting that same share of their profitability.
Right.
And they are not then able to allow money to do its purpose, change hands.
Absolutely, and I think this was a good point that kind of occurred to me when we were having that conversation earlier. Is it's the minimum wage isn't supposed to be a living wage argument that you hear all the time, which is utter bullshit. The minimum wage was instituted as a living wage.
Right. If anybody knows the actual point of
Right.
it.
And there's no such thing as unskilled labor. Like if we're being
yeah.
every job takes skill. If you need somebody to do it, they have to have a skill.
Right. If it didn't take skill, you could have a robot do it like that.
And
But-
there's a difference between specialized and unspecialized labor, but all
Sure.
labor is skilled labor.
Yeah, right.
Like you are specialized labor. You can do a task that requires, but all labor
1,500
is
hours.
Yeah, but hand me a shovel, I'm pretty useless. So that is a skill still too.
Absolutely.
Depends on where you live, though. Minnesota, a lot of people are skilled in shoveling.
Yes, this is true. All the ditch diggers. But the look at, this isn't supposed to be the job you can support yourself on. They're not worth, flipping burgers isn't worth $15 or $20 an hour. It's like, all right, let's take away from what they're worth and let's look at the productivity they create for the company. How much money does the company make off of their hour of labor? That is what they're worth. Right? That's how much they make. Now, granted, the company has overhead. The company needs to make money off of its labor. That's part of it. But that is their value. Their total worth is the productivity that they produce for that company, and it should be a percentage of that. It shouldn't matter how you feel about the job they're doing. It should just be directly tied to they provide a service that is worth X to a company. They are entitled to X amount of that.
Yeah, you just described the way that wages work right now. Just we're not getting a big enough portion of that pie.
Right. I mean, it's true, but yeah.
But it also comes back to that work has dignity to it, and you should be able to live a dignified life.
Right. Well, it depends on who you ask. if you, I don't know.
Right.
The thought used to be if you work 40 hours, then you deserve to have a dignified a life.
A stay-at-home wife, 2 cars,
At least a car.
Yeah.
And some kids.
House in the burbs.
Right.
We can even update that. One of the partners should be able to stay at home. You should be able to support a couple kids on that. You should be able to own your own condo, apartment,
Yeah.
house,
Townhome,
whatever
yeah.
your dream is. Those should be attainable things, and
They used to be.
Yeah, and
They used to be.
That's what good wages do for the American economy.
Right.
It's what all those people talk about how the 50s were so great.
That's the reality of the 50s. That's why it was so great.
that
Well,
was part
for
of-
some people.
I mean, for
a very
us, it was
small-
great for
yeah.
us,
Yes.
But if you were not a white dude, life was not as easy back then. We
No.
want to make sure we don't repeat that mistake again.
Right.
Well, we have repeated it. It's just no longer is it purely a race delineation as much as it is a class delineation. Exactly.
yeah.
And it's not as blatant, obviously, but there a lot of the side effects of like redlining and all those business practices are still here
Alive and
today.
well, yeah.
People say, "Oh, it hasn't been around for a generation or two." And it's like that doesn't solve generational wealth gaps. Like a person's life, maybe a
Yeah.
person and a half's life, is not gonna like fix the problems that
Achieve
were
the
created.
same generational wealth of
Yeah.
Grandpappy back in 1865 got 50 acres and a mule from the U.S. government,
That'd be
and now
40.
that piece of property is worth $20 million, and like it's
It was 40 acres, and the mule was like maybe iffy, but
It was a thing that maybe didn't get happened and it was a problem. But I also think that when you go back to redlining, that then kind of institutionalized lower relegating folks to a lower socioeconomic class. And now then you can roll into like the credit system and the credit scores and what we're doing now.
there were a lot of
education,
mechanisms.
and
It's
effectively say, hey, well, it's not racist, but it's math now.
Right.
But it was
Yeah.
rooted in that.
right.
It didn't change in terms of who it's affecting. It
And-
just changed in terms of what we call it now.
Yeah, and the socioeconomic status of the fact that where these people, because of Redline, were relegated to live, now have lower property values in those areas, which means their schools are underfunded, which means their kids do not have. They're already starting. They're already starting 2 legs down. And now you're just knocking them down another peg of they can't even get the same quality education as the people who had the generational wealth, who live in a better neighborhood, who have a better funded school. It's like it's so many assets and facets that you just can't wrap your head around. All
yeah,
of the ways that it
but if they just get some more bootstraps,
It's just not
when
enough
somebody
straps,
chops your straps again,
you got to tie new
just
ones on.
just get new ones.
Well,
you
I
know?
got boots on, and I'm on it. And like, if I start pulling my bootstraps, I'm not
right.
going to fly because it turns out it's impossible. It is a good criticism of it that has been hijacked by
Right.
us, taking it the wrong way.
It's like
which is
the most ironic
freaking
thing to
slot.
say too, because it was literally like created as a saying to be ironic that it is impossible,
Right.
and it's been co-opted to be like if you do this impossible thing, but it's no longer impossible, you're gonna be good.
Yeah, that.
Completely off topic, but it's like the no
Eddie.
bad apples.
Right.
No bad apples. Analogy.
When you say the full saying, so it's just a few bad apples, and a few bad apples spoil the bunch.
barrel, yeah.
When you leave the spoil the bunch off, well, it's just a few bad apples. It's a discount. When you say it ruins all of it, which is what it was.
That's the intention of the saying. And
The
it's
intention of the
just
saying.
weird how these sayings get co-opted to mean the opposite of what they were intended. But yeah, so back
Yeah.
to this, and I think
Let's jump back into the union discussion.
Back to the unions. And
Squirrel.
I get this a lot too, like when I talk about the real damages that Reagan has done, and these kinds of movements have done that happened in the 70s and 80s, and I get a lot of people who are like, you're being disingenuous. You know that was 40 years ago, and what people don't understand is that policy is built upon policy, and
Right.
it took 100 years to get to where we were.
Right.
And when you pull the bottom out from underneath that, you knock the foundation in. That is now the new precedent, and you have to build policy that had already been built on the backs of the coal miners and the railroad workers and the postal workers and everybody who had fought to get to where we were. You knock all of their work down, you've got to start all that back over from scratch. And 40 years is yesterday in that perspective.
Right. Well, if people want to look at like America only, like that's like 20% of like that's not that much.
No.
That's a pretty small percentage. Like it's not that much.
And I think it is important to talk about the fact that, you know, union criticism does have some merit, right? There's things that unions have done to themselves that need to be acknowledged so we can avoid those problems that undermine themselves. And I think when unions were really at the height of their power, they had a lot of power. They were massively politically powerful. They were massively socially powerful. And so there was a fair amount of corruption that would go on. You know, there was a lot of mafia influence. There was some issues that I think merit at least talking about.
Yeah, maybe the kickoff question for that is more of a, if unions are so great, why did they go from 37 Americans being it down to 10%? What went wrong?
Right.
And I will say some of it was self-inflicted by unions, corruption being one of it. Once you pool a bunch of money together and you have an organization, corruption is possible to take place. You have to fight that at every single stage.
Yeah, I just love that it's so directed. It's so highlighted in unions, though, when the same corruption happens in pretty much every organization that's ever existed. Nonprofit, private companies, school board treasurers, like there's corruption.
Everywhere.
It's American. It's people.
It's people and greed.
And people and greed and the opportunity. And it, you know,
and I think
there's a whole discussion to be had on just human nature and greed.
And I think that's an incredibly important point is people like to point out that it's like, oh yeah, corruption, and this is why they shouldn't exist. And it's like, no, yes, there's corruption, and we should do things to address the problem. And I think this comes back to, again, like Reagan and the mental health institutions. And it's like, so there were some problems with the mental health institutions. Sure, they were not perfect. They will never be perfect. But shutting them down and kicking everybody out on the street did not fix that problem. And that's the same thing with unions. Is you can say, yeah, there was some corruption. Shutting down the unions and just kicking everybody into, you know, this capitalist hellscape was also not the solution to that problem.
Yeah. Well, what were some of those things that went to shut down unions? What were some of those things that, you know, what were the cuts that they died by? Because it didn't seem like they died by any one thing, right?
Yeah, honestly, I was thinking about it, and I think it almost goes back to the original NLRA Act, National Labor Relations Act, in the 1930s, in that they sort of set the playbook for like how unions can work, right? But they also set limitations. And the biggest limitation, and one that not all countries have, is that you can, as a union, you cannot strike on behalf of another union. So like, even though they may be conjecturally related to you, just or adjacently related, you have to be directly, like, it has to be your union and your industry.
Yeah.
Versus some place like France, where that is not the case, where even though they have a 10% union rate of their working population, which is the same in the United States, who do you think of currently that riots, that has more strikes than
Viva
France?
la Revolution!
That's right. It's France, and partly because literally you don't even have to be in a union to like be in solidarity and go on to the strikes. And you know, obviously you don't have to be in a union today to go on the picket line, but like,
but it ain't gonna do you are going to get fired if you go join a
right. You
union,
can't just take off work.
Yeah.
You get hard enough to get sick days in the United States, much less taking paid days off.
Yeah, when you don't have those protections to go withhold your labor and still be able to come back to your job once that argument is settled, that's problematic, and it does very much limit the powers of workers.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think also federal workers are not allowed to strike. And haven't been for a long time, and this was part of what gave Reagan the power to cripple the air traffic controller strikes. But then this tends to extend to other things like railroad workers who aren't technically federal workers, but they carry the mail. That's a federal service. That's why the president can come in and say, you can't strike anymore. And this has happened repeatedly. And then, you know, the post office workers who, they have a decent union, but their union has lacks of leverage in these kinds of situations. And again, when the precedent gets set that those unions lose a battle, that's a precedent that reverberates through the rest of labor.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then people see that, and it's like, well, what's the point in joining a union if they can't successfully do these things, and paying these dues if they can't successfully do these things? And I think that was one of the things that kind of hurt unions as well.
For sure. And then you have, I was just on the way up here, I was listening to a video or a podcast, whatever, of this guy who he had very minor point in his story, but that right to work laws, I see you have it here, it's a great point, in that it was like sort of created by this like Texas businessman in like
Of course it's
the
Texas.
earliest 20th century.
It's great marketing too, right? Your right to work.
Right. And boy, and the way he said it was, as you can imagine, in the early 20th century, incredibly racist. In that, like, it went, unions will force his white men and women to work next to African American apes in the workplace. Apparently, that's a negative for unions.
You know.
And that's a negative we got to own. We'll own that one.
Right. Well, and so he was kind of the originator of right to work laws, and down there in Texas. So that was his anecdote of history.
Yeah, and one of those things is like, all of a sudden, right to work has many different forms. One of those forms being, though, you can have the union negotiate for you and not pay dues. So the infrastructure that got you this pay,
Right.
all of a sudden you don't have to pay for it. You become a freeloader, and you can feel good about it because your state government said you should.
Right.
Yep.
And that's not a good thing either.
Well, and that undermines the union's power because now they're not getting paid, which is, I mean, it's funny. It sounds good on its face. It's always an easy one to sell. Is, hey, you can get these services and not pay for them. It's like, that's great. But now the union has less power to fight for those.
Right. It's a short-term gain for a long-term loss.
Yep.
Right.
And that's not a dagger that kills you, but it makes it weaker. And
Right. You're still hemorrhaging over the years, right?
yeah, and a weak union turns out can't get those other quality of life benefits, can't help you keep up with the productivity that that workers kind of have shown they deserve and need in order to live fulfilling lives.
Absolutely.
And I think we see that in a lot of unions right now, like UPS and whatnot, where the drivers, because those are the majority of the workers, right? And those are the people who are most front-facing. You see your UPS driver every day, or well, maybe not every day. Depends on how much your wife orders from Amazon, right?
Yeah.
But you see them every day, so they get a lot of the frontline fighting by the unions, but then the mechanics and the backline workers, they get treated like shit, and even by the union, and they have a lot more anti-union sentiment in those situations because it's like, we see our coworkers who, we're the ones loading the trucks, we're the ones fixing the trucks, we're doing all the work that makes their jobs possible.
Right.
And they get all the glory. They get the $50 an hour to drive a truck around. I'm here breaking my back in a 120-degree warehouse, loading these trucks for a fraction of what they're getting paid, and my union doesn't do anything to change that for me, or it doesn't do enough in my eyes to change that for me. And I think that probably doesn't do a whole lot of. But
it shows how unions have to take that feedback from their workers and apply it and go get those quality of life gains, because money doesn't necessarily fix some of those other issues. Like, hey, I'd rather have air conditioning in this building because it is hot and humid, and I would rather work in a better environment where it is easier to do the work than more difficult without having it.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that's got to lead into that, just kind of that corruption point, in that a lot of companies, from their point of view, rightfully give kickbacks to union leaders who maybe don't push as hard or don't push in every direction that they could, because they get a little bit of that money back. And obviously that's not right by any stretch of the mean, but like, that's just another thing that a corporation can do that can protect their interests. If they pay this guy $20,000 for this vote, they can save $200,000 by not having them push as hard for the agreement.
Well, and sowing that discord amongst the workers does a good job of undermining faith in the union and making the union weaker still.
Yeah, it's double-edged sword for sure.
Companies definitely want to discredit the union as much as possible because they want a weak union, because they want to be able to steamroll. Moreover, though, companies do that with auto workers in one of their distant contracts back from 2009 after the restructures with bankruptcy, where they had a two-tier wage system.
Yeah.
We did that at the airlines in the 90s, and we know it doesn't work because it breeds a lot of content, because you're doing the same job for less money. And
right.
It is inherently unfair that way. The company knows that, and the company is fully in for doing that because they know that it, again, weakens the union.
Yep.
It not only does it weaken the union, but it allows them to pay people less to do the same work and just kind of skirt by the whole reason why the union exists.
Yep.
So,
and that's in organizations that already have unions, but they've made it harder to create a union in an organization as well. I mean,
there's no doubt about that.
You look at Look at how hard Amazon workers have been working to try
I couldn't believe how difficult the fight was in Staten Island in New York for that one warehouse to unionize. I mean, Amazon warehouses are like the worst warehouse to work for in today's America, in today's workplace. They have like double the amount of workplace injuries than any other warehouse. Like Walmart's the next biggest warehouse, and they have double the amount of warehouse injuries every year than Walmart does. So
Can you imagine making Walmart look like the good guy?
right, it's got to be a first.
Okay, so we picked on the Biden administration a little bit about their union stuff, but we got to give them a little bit of a credit here now. This administration has made it easier for unions to form and made it harder for companies to block that. Because now I'm not super familiar with the nitty gritty of union starting practices, and I've never been in a union. But you have to get the 51% or 50% plus one.
Effectively, you need to pass around a petition. You then need to get enough signatures on the petition. You then need to go over and get people to vote and get your 50% to then go form a union. You then have to make the efforts and form the union within a time frame, and then you have to collectively bargain with the company, of which the company is hacking away at your hamstrings the whole time.
So to your point, all those steps that you've got to take gives the company a lot of opportunities to slither in there and try to sabotage that process. And they do, and they have. I mean, companies work way harder to block unions from forming than they do to try to break existing unions, right?
I mean, companies are still outsourcing to the bad guys from union started. You know of the Pinkertons. They still exist, and they still do the same thing.
The fact that the Pinkertons still exist is insane to me. But but
they've never heard of rebranding, actually.
They have now made this where if the company does anything to try to interfere or dissuade those union starting processes, it goes automatically into a recognized registered union. They don't have to go through all those steps, and then the company is forced to collectively bargain with them.
Right, and this can happen after, like, say a vote had failed or whatnot. If it was proven that the company interfered, they can just go straight into, you are now union because they interfered, and now they do have to bargain with you. Which, obviously, that's a huge win.
Huge win.
What is it? 40% of workplaces commit labor violations during a union creation or whatever. I think is what I saw.
I believe you. I don't know the. But
I'm pretty sure.
It.
I heard 40%, something along those lines of labor union violations, or just workplace violations, or surrounding union creation or union votes.
And that's huge. And so, I want to take everybody to take a moment and see that we now criticized the current administration for something that we believe they did wrong, and gave them credit for something we believe they did right. And that's how you don't be in a cult.
Well, you just don't fall in love with a politician unless they shake your hand, give you a hug, maybe slap on the butt a little bit. I could see some affection growing out of something like that. But
So you're telling us your love language is physical touch?
Oh yeah, my wife knows that.
Shoulder rub.
Oh, at least that's just to get started.
Sniffing joke insert here.
But again, since one of the hypotheses that Jordan's always on is it's always Reagan's fault. What blame does Reagan own in this?
I mean, a lot of it. Honestly, I think the crowning achievement of Reagan's union busting was absolutely the air traffic controllers.
Right.
And for everybody who doesn't remember, just a quick recap: air traffic control is one of the hardest jobs on the planet. Probably, they have an insanely high suicide rate.
I know that.
Yeah.
You have to start the job by the time you're 28. You have to retire by 55, and it is one of the most high-intensity jobs in terms of, if you mess up and two airplanes bump into each other, the people probably die, and it can be in the hundreds very easily if it's, international airport and two wide-body airplanes getting vectored wrong.
It could be in the thousands, or 1,000 at that point, right? Some of these planes carry over 500 people.
Yeah, they're in the 300s, 400s, and,
I guess
and help you what they land on. Like if they land on,
just look at Breaking Bad. That one air traffic controller who Donners dies, and then those two planes crash, and then it's like crazy.
But that's great. Have you ever seen Pushing Tin?
I have, and the whole premise of you need to feel the power of a jet engine to understand it is a little dumb. However, the aspect of air traffic control, especially in that era, is very well depicted. So
yeah,
you should
so
watch
it's a good movie if you really want to understand like how difficult that job is. And these people, because constantly understaffed, so constantly being asked to being overworked, and once again goes back to your safety, my safety, your safety specifically,
Right.
definitely every day of your job. These people, they need to be on their game. It wasn't even necessarily a pay thing. It is a quality of life thing. We need more time off. We need more help. We need more of stuff that's not just pay. And they were fighting for that. They're federal workers, technically not allowed to strike, and they're like, fuck you, we're striking anyway. They did that, and then Reagan painted them, and this is, I think, honestly, maybe the most damaging thing, is Reagan painted them as being greedy, because they made still decent money at the time, I think.
Yeah, they did.
Painted them as they just want more. They get too much, and they make more than you probably do, and they're striking for more. They're greedy, the welfare queen type, that type of lazy, entitled, and really sold the public against them and against unions, and then broke them. He's like, you either go back to work tomorrow or you're fired. They didn't go back to work. He fired them all. And
what do you know? There's a shortage of air traffic controller workers. It's crazy.
Yeah, and the current shortage does not necessarily stem from that. There are a number of things that need to be fixed, and that the FAA says they're working on it. But when they say we've hired this many people, it doesn't mean that 100% of them get through training, and then by the time they have to go certify, not 100% of them certify. So you're losing.
Right. Not to mention people retiring at the same time. So
exactly.
it's like
and
you
as they
could
were
very
retiring
well.
along the way, it makes it so they are still worse off than they were.
To your point, then, with the retirement and the people phasing out and everything, and like right now. That's what your union's dealing with is, obviously flying a plane, you should be sort of on your game, sharp about just a little bit,
Yeah, I'd say it's probably important. I mean, the TikTok trend right now is, could your husband land an airplane if he had to? And every husband will say yes.
And the answer to that is no.
No.
They would get to the ground.
No, just not smoothly.
And, you might survive them getting to the ground even. And that's
the plane is probably not going to survive it. The people...
The plane will not fly again, and the people may. And so I was like, I could totally do it. No, you really,
don't these planes just land themselves these days? Let's get some Ross in there.
I've had some passengers that would know that I landed it. We arrived there. I think they yelled "Go Navy" afterward. Very much paragliding.
The airline industry has long neglected getting new blood in for pilots because, so I just learned this today. 10 years ago, you fly a regional jet for a major airline. 10 years ago, people doing your exact job in 2013, what were they making?
$23,500 per year, so $23,500 a year in the year of our Lord 2013, and that got upped a little bit later to around $56,000. But in 2013, that's where they were at, and I got fun facts. I was making around $38,000 working a different job then, and was barely making ends meet.
Right. I was gonna say, isn't that below the poverty line of 2013?
By a lot.
Yeah, we did the math. Even at kind of paying McDonald's wages at the time, working a 40-hour week at McDonald's, you'd have made more money.
But it only takes 5 at that point, probably 500 training hours, and how many
that was still, you needed to qualify for your 1,500 hours.
Oh, it was 1,500 still?
It was still the 1,500-hour rule had been implemented in 2010.
Oh, okay.
And you'd think that would have helped. No, it dissuaded more people from getting into it,
Right.
and there was still kind of a glut. But then over the years, all of a sudden people were looking at it like, I'm not going to pay the immense training costs to get into doing aviation.
So it's still $50,000-$60,000 a year.
Yeah, to get $23,000 a year and then $55,000 a year. No, that's stupid. I'm not paying $100,000 to get into a job that's going to take me 10 years to maybe realize and kind of get my return on.
Yeah, that doesn't really compute.
And so, and then again, because that was just the airlines being greedy, right? They went through some hard times, obviously, 08, 09, 2011, then 08, 09. They went through some hard times. It makes sense that they were maybe trying to be fiscally responsible, but that also neglected getting new blood into the profession because, again, nobody's going to want to fucking do that for that price. I wouldn't do that for that price.
No.
I wouldn't do anything for, there's very few jobs I would do. It would have to give me immense personal pleasure to do a job for $23,000 or $20,000 a year.
You could find a job like that.
Probably. But now that there's a huge shortage of pilots, right?
Yeah, and in part that was one of the contributing factors to that and that is what has driven up wages. When I signed up, I was going to be making around $56,000 a year as pilot, and I was super excited, first year, first officer. By the time that I actually started, starting pay was $100,000 a year. So I was super excited, but in part of that was a combination of both, a supply of labor and a good union to back that up and realize the gains, because the companies don't want to pay any more than they absolutely have to.
Yep.
Yeah.
And to your point, now non-union pilots are making 10 grand plus a year less, plus a lot less quality of life benefits and everything. But now to fix this, and this is what the union's fighting for, that's not even wage related, or try to fix it, which is what they did before. When did pilots used to have to retire by?
They used to have to retire, I believe it was at 62, and they upped it to 65. It might have been 60 though, so we'll have to
60, 65, whatever. It went from 60 something to 65.
Right. They matched it to Medicare, I think, was the big concern.
Yeah, they more matched it to what the international standard was for all the other countries.
Oh, sure.
Which is
ICAO.
how they sold that one. But now,
and they did the safety studies too to back up that yes, in fact, going from 60 to 65, 62, 65, you are still a safe pilot. Accidents are not going to increase because we've increased the age.
Sure.
They haven't done that in this one. It's a bunch of people saying, I want to be able to be an airline pilot for a couple of years longer. I can help fulfill the shortage by sticking around a couple years longer.
Well, I was also looking into it, and it seems like once you reach near that age of 65, I thought there was a statistic where it was about a third of the pilots who were like actively, still employed by the airlines were on medical leave.
So very rarely do we get a glimpse into this particular bit. The United CO did come up and volunteer the information of pilots that are age 64 that work for them. I believe it was 38% are on either short-term or long-term disability right now.
Right. So they're not even working.
If you go longer, like you're not getting as money to stay, then that doesn't include the people that retired before.
Right.
Or the people that are going to retire because they don't want to work that much longer and they're still going to retire whether they can work longer or not.
So it's a pretty diminishing return sort of strategy.
And again, on the safety thing, like, have you ever driven through Boca Raton? Like, people's ability to operate machinery does not get better as they get older.
Not in my experience.
It's not an apples to apples comparison.
No.
But under the with pilots over age 65 flying private jets and charters on what's called the 135 rules, they do have a higher fatal accident rate than pilots that are under the age of 65. Now, there are some other factors within what's airline, which is 121, it's kind of the gold standard, that 135 doesn't have to attain the absolute gold standard. They do have to be very good. They are safe. But make no mistake that they do have hull losses once in a while. Airlines don't.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, this would also create a concern with international flights, right? Because the international standard is 65. So 65 plus would have a lot of issues flying to Europe.
And I think that would be one of the other major things is, so say you're senior wide-body captain flying a very big airplane from U.S. to Europe or U.S. to Asia, whatever you're doing, working days a week. Now you're not doing that big, long 8-9 hours in a row and 8-9 hours back. You're doing the 737s bopping around.
Right, it's harder on your body, I bet.
Well, there's a lot more work. Takeoff and landing is the work part.
Right.
Cruise is easy.
He
Autopilot,
sits back
baby.
on a lazy boat. Like, literally, they've got a foot recliner you can lean back on.
Does it have the massagers too, like the calf massagers and the back massagers?
That's the next thing your union needs to work on right there.
Maybe we should start pulling for that.
I don't know why that's not in the agreement right now. Seems like easy win.
I think another thing that people will be mad if we don't talk about, kind of bringing it back to not airline related stuff, with really what did damage to the unions was, just a union strike in general was the post office strike of the 1970s. And again, another federal agency that is technically not allowed to strike, right? But there's a thing called a wildcat strike. Wildcat. Wow. And a wildcat strike means that the union had nothing to do with the strike. Well, nothing, to do with the strike in quotation marks. But it was organized independently, and everybody's just like, I am sick today. We all got together for an after work meeting around the country and caught the same flu. Yeah. Can't show up to work today.
Seems reasonable.
Yep, and you can do stuff that's not full work stoppage, but you can do work slowing, and you can make stuff. And so this was happening in the 1970s, and they brought in the National Guard or the federal troops to try to do the job of the post office to prove that they didn't need them, and it went disastrously. Like they're like, we've got no fucking idea how to move mail, you know, which is crazy too, because the United States Army wins wars on logistics. Like the United States Army is the best in the world at logistics, and mail is logistics, but it's apparently a very different kind of logistics.
We move like tanks and bodies and equipment from point A over here, and we move it to point B. Big shipments. I'd say the logistics side would be much more akin to like a logistics company,
right?
Not the mail service,
not the USPS, and so they ended up getting a big win out of that because there
unskilled labor.
Yeah. But like it's a point of how effective strikes can be, because you can say that maybe you can get people to cross the picket line and come do this job, but can you though? You know what I mean? Is there that's the most powerful country in the world with an on-tap workforce that has to do exactly what they're told because it's the military and has more money than fucking God to just throw at whatever dumb thing they want to throw it at.
Have you ever tried working the register at a new job and nobody told you how to work the register?
Oh my.
Because I'll tell you what, that's pretty confusing. And that's a register, not running the entire postal service. Even one job, I bet, is like a little daunting if there's nobody there to be like, no, not that, not that, not that. No, it's over there to your left, your other left. Right there. Got it. You got it. It only took 5 minutes to do a 1 minute job. You did it.
Yep. And that's a great point. And back to the point that there's no such thing as unskilled work.
Yeah.
Every job.
Do you want to check out quickly? I don't know. I kind of do. I kind of like to get my stuff and get going.
Also, I want to say that anybody who's ever worked retail or food service, hospitality, like, will tell you that is the worst fucking job that they've ever had in their entire life. Like,
it's
definitely up there. I mean, there's some shittier jobs, probably like pumping porta potties. But
pun intended.
But the service economy, which is what we have, is a very large part of it, and we make the baseline one of the most miserable jobs for a host of reasons, and it pays about the least of anything. You know, you can say corruption, right to work, what Reagan did. All of those other tactics that get employed by companies to stop unions in their infancy from starting, or to get rid of unions once they're there,
or make them ineffective even if they still exist.
To sow that discord amongst the workers, to discredit the union at all turns, which, you know, it plays into the company's hands because it makes it harder for the union to negotiate on your behalf. After you know, basically 20 years, I'd say from 1970 to the late 80s, this was chipping away at unions, especially from the 60s to early 80s, certainly. And at that point, they became vulnerable. When they became vulnerable, what happened to, you know, American wages?
Tanked. Or, well, they stagnated. I shouldn't say they tanked. They stagnated, which is one and the same at this point, you know.
Right, rent increased at the exact same pace that it always was, and wages did not.
Yeah.
And did company margins stay, you know, roughly at that 15-ish per profit percent?
No.
They might have increased a little bit, just double-digit percentages year over year for a while.
Continue, and then top brass salaries in those corporations
exploded.
Increase, you know, where I think, what was it, used to be like 5 or 7 times the lowest worker salary, something along those lines.
Yeah, I believe the average kind of peaked out. It was approximately, and the CEO's pay was 8 times what the average worker's was.
And now it's I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it is like in the hundreds of times what the average worker.
The last I saw was in the 400s of times.
Yeah.
Like, it is kind of out of control.
And that, so again,
you could work less than a day as a CEO and make more than one person working the entire year, every single day, not taking a single day off. But you could work 4 hours. In those 4 hours, it's worth more to the company than you. Like, it's not even fathomable. Like, there's no way to correlate that to make it make sense.
Good leadership is important. However, I think there's a couple CEOs that show that they are worth so much because what they can do this to the stock price for the shareholders, which, you know, control the board, which control who the CEO is. And then to turn that over and be like, well, you know, if we can up the stock price this much, this quickly, and we can then put you a little bit extra, we can beat earnings and beat our profits from last year, and in turn not give as much to workers, it then enriches shareholders a little more.
Nope. The problem is that that's an unsustainable business model, and it's an unsustainable business model we've been running on for a long time, because eventually you can't continue to increase percentage over percentage every year by cutting every corner and leaning out the workforce and leaning out, going longer on maintenance and leaning out facility. The product continues to tumble, the service continues to tumble in quality, and then eventually the corporations fold, or you're just left with, you have nothing more to choose from now but really shitty options of these monopolized industries that you get junk.
Yeah, capitalism is a great engine with the right, controls on it. If you have a good engine but don't put revenue on it and then just mash your foot on the gas, which is what we've told CEOs to do, you will blow that motor up soon enough. And it turns out they are. And at some point, the fallout is going to be felt by everyone else.
Yep.
And that's kind of the problem.
It is. And unfortunately, what seems crazy to me is that they are so self-absorbed with their own personal success that they don't see that this will eventually end up screwing them in the long run too. Because if you don't have people who can afford to buy your shit, and you don't have people who will work for you anymore, and you don't have people who can afford to live in the places that your company exists because it's gotten too expensive to live there, you don't have anybody who's you're not making any money because you got nobody to sell to anymore.
And moreover, if you can't afford to have kids, there's not going to be that next generation worker that comes up, and this whole experiment's going to come to an end, especially if there's no one else to work. You're kind of done with it.
Well, and your point on capitalism, and I have a lot to say about it, as you might guess.
I know that is a relatively controversial view in this room.
And it depends on who you talk to, because if you look at somebody like Adam Smith, who's like almost coined as the creator of capitalism per se, is that the invisible hand of capitalism. That's nice. That's nice. He said at some point that capitalism, when done correctly, can be pretty productive. But one of the things he said, in order for it to be done productively, is that the profits of that capitalist enterprise have to be distributed to his workers, because if it's not, then they'll eventually no longer have any capital to purchase the goods of whatever they're buying, whatever they're
socialism,
creating.
Okay? Social communism.
One of the creators of the modern capitalist system suggested that we have worker co-ops.
Yeah.
He suggested that the workers need to own part of the means of production.
Right.
Which sounds very much not like capitalism.
At least not as we know it today.
No. And I also think, going back to when was America great, and our, and aside from tax rates and everything, and people who want to discredit FDR's social policies, just slightly not as good for unions as Biden, but FDR did a few things for unions.
Maybe.
When they want to discredit those, and they're like, well, it was the Second World War that got us out of the Depression, that got us, this robust economy. And it's like, all right, great, I'll bite. Let's pretend that all of the numerous New Deal policies, like Social Security, that half these motherfuckers are cashing their check without complaint every month, and the National Labor Relations Board, and all of these things that still exist today, FDIC. Right. Those didn't do anything. Those didn't accomplish anything.
No, Social Security and Medicare, basically nobody cares about it. Hasn't been popular. Hasn't been useful.
Definitely not a thing people vote on. Nobody's lost an election over wanting to cut Medicare.
Definitely wouldn't count on a particular voting bloc to be a proponent for any of those policies.
But the fact that they then point to the Second World War, it's like, all right, great. Well, first of all, still FDR's policies on how we handled the war. Second of all, what kind of economy did we have during the Second World War? The government sort of took over all of private industry, said you're going to pay your laborers this. This is what the wages are going to be. This is what you're going to make these products that we tell you to make. We're going to pay you this amount to make them, and you're going to make them by this date.
And you will make this amount of profit margin.
Yeah.
It almost sounds like there was a plan centrally devised for manufacturing goods.
A planned economy. What type of economies are planned? I forget. It's not none of that, capitalism, right? Capitalism's planned, the planned economy.
Yeah, the invisible hand of the market has a great plan.
They plan to make more money. That's the plan.
That is
make
the plan.
more money.
And so, like, that's why I always think it's funny, because obviously we had 20 years of war and a Great Recession right in the fucking middle of it. War does not dictate a good economy.
Clearly.
But a planned economy during war apparently dictated a good economy, according to the people who think communism was the worst thing in the world.
Especially if you win the war. If you lose, it still probably sucks.
Yeah, it's
You know,
true.
it does help that, you know, the competition across in Europe was bombed into non-existence for a minute. It does help that when you brought your troops back, or the fighters back, you educated them and sent them
Right.
back into your economy.
You created
to
the
go
most
be
educated
productive.
class of workers like ever in the history of the United States.
I push back a little bit up to that point, certainly. But
Sure.
I
Well,
would
no,
argue
right,
that-
up to that point. Yeah.
We're the most educated history
Well,
in
yeah.
history now.
Unfortunately.
Yeah,
Also,
we're making great money because we're so
yeah,
educated.
So much student loan money. It's great. It's great.
Reagan again. Different episode though.
Yeah.
But yeah, so like I think that you know, it's important to really understand that history of labor unions really around the turn of the century gave us everything we've come to expect and take for granted. From the 40-hour work week to the paid holiday to paid overtime to you know, OSHA, which a lot of people bitch about and whatever. But like,
Hey, Nixon actually did a pretty good thing there. I mean, but he was sort of forced by unions to do it,
He
you know.
was, yeah.
But still, he made the step, and he obviously
and this is why I give Nixon more credit than most people give him. Nixon
Yeah.
did a lot of really shitty stuff, and Nixon was Reagan 1.0.
right. He was like evil. He was like the mini me evil.
Yeah.
You know, he like kind of wanted to do evil, but like he was also like, let's save some trees.
He did a lot of
He
really
was
good
petty.
things.
Obviously, some of the bigger factors of why you'd want to be in union is the pay. I know, like, I consider pay to be a reason why I would work somewhere.
Generally, the first reason you go to work is a
Yeah,
paycheck. Like that's the
You stop paying me, I stop showing up. It's
Yeah,
it's just that simple.
You know, volunteering is great and all, but
But there's a lot of things to be gained outside of just pay. There's a lot of quality of life things, work-life balance things that people used to have. You know, one person could be at home working, raising kids, or not. You know, whatever.
Yeah.
And we've lost a lot of those benefits that our grandparents and great-grandparents were able to have.
you know,
Yeah, another one of those big things is at-will employment, right? You know, it sounds great, has a very good ring to it, but it also means that, you know, you can be dismissed for any reason, not told that reason, and it doesn't have to be just.
Yeah.
And, you know, at least at my union, if we're going to get dismissed from our job, there has to be just cause.
Right.
It's not going to guarantee you don't get a blanket job for life. You still have
Right.
to perform well. You still have to do what you're
That's
supposed to do.
I hear all the argument all the time. You can never get fired if you work at a union
You
shop.
very much can.
Yeah,
Well,
I guarantee you, you're gonna get
it's
fired
really
if you
not
stop
that
showing
hard.
up.
They act, and there is some shuffling that goes around, especially depending on the union, or you know, the things that pretend to be unions, like the police, the fraternity of police, where you cannot get fired. Like you have to literally kill a guy. And
No, they
caught
take
on
that to
camera.
they take that to the next level.
Right.
It's,
So there's definitely like some of that where there's maybe some merit, and some people definitely in like the construction industry will sit around and be like, oh, you know, I have to work with this dipshit, and they won't fire him because of the union, and he probably doesn't know that it's because of the union, and it's probably not because of the union. They just can't find anybody, and they need a warm body to push a broom or whatever the fuck they need.
Sure.
But yeah, that is a good point. That is one of the things that criticizes unions, and you absolutely can get fired. Being in a union does not guarantee you a job.
It guarantees that you have just process. But, you know, if you are not doing the thing that they are paying you to do, then they're going to allow you to be successful somewhere else.
Yep.
It's really fair.
allow you to be successful
like that.
somewhere else. I love it.
But yeah, certainly unions need to get more credit on a lot of the quality of life things because, A, you need the pay to have the quality of life. But then once you have the pay and you don't have quality of life, you're still a miserable human being.
Right.
You still want to be able to spend time.
There's
You
still things
wanna
you
have
need.
Hobbies. You still want to be able to, you know, spend time with the people you enjoy spending.
The lack of these quality of life things, the lack of this financial security, and I don't think, I mean, this is true, people are putting off all of the other big, the life things, you know, the things that you're supposed to do in your life, you know, buying a house. Not even that people are putting it off, they just can't do it. You know what I mean? Like 20%, both of you right now are working on trying to buy a house. And it's a process. It's a process that thankfully all of us around this desk at the moment have the luxury of being able to hopefully achieve. But it's
Of
not
course.
easy.
And it's not supposed to be a luxury. That's supposed to be a necessity.
That's just supposed to
Right.
be the bare minimum, and
Unless you get brainwashed in that renting is the American dream.
oh yeah, well it's
For your landlord.
Exactly.
and then if you can't buy a house, it's hard to be married and rent. It's hard to be have a kid in an apartment. Who wants to be in a 1-bedroom with 3 kids? Nobody wants that. And all of these things make it really difficult to do the things that our parents and our grandparents did. I can't stress enough how important, even if you're not in a union, it is to support organized labor, because it changes how all of us are affected by the markets.
Yeah, I mean, there's giant, massive social changes that have occurred from unions, and even at that time, 30% of America at its height was in a union. Mm-hmm. So that 30% power struggle proliferated into the entirety of the United States. So 30% of the people can make a giant fucking difference.
Without a doubt. And, on top of that, capital allows you other options. Capital allows you to start a business. Capital allows you to have time to go volunteer in your community. Live the American fucking dream.
Absolutely.
I don't know. Is that even a thing anymore? Like, I thought we threw that away.
We did.
Or sold it to somebody.
The nightmare.
we outsourced it to somebody.
Oh, yeah, they outsourced. Yeah, right.
Offshore, sorry.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Made in China. So I think the call to action here is, at the very, very minimum, support labor, support union.
Workers need to be for workers. Solidarity is important.
Yep.
Yeah. If you still have to work every 2 weeks and then you get that paycheck and you need that paycheck, then you're a worker. Yep. If you stopped working and you didn't have money to pay your bills, you're a worker. Yep. So it doesn't matter, like, if you're making $100,000 or $30,000, probably you're still relying on that paycheck. And if you're relying on a paycheck, then you're a worker, and you need to support other workers, because it will affect you in some way, shape, or form, whether it's you getting somebody who doesn't know how to bag groceries, or work a register.
Who does that anymore, right?
Or just you.
What are some of the policy changes that help make this happen?
So we need to just vote for politicians who run on pro-union platforms.
Yeah.
Right off the bat, if
Bare
they
minimum.
are,
If that's the only thing
do
you
not
vote
vote for right to work. Sounds good. It's bad. Do not vote for right to work.
It's not good.
No state with a right to work policy has a robust economy. Like maybe Texas. I haven't looked into that, but vote for politicians and policy that just strengthens unions, right? And then if you can, it's easier now than it has been in a long time. Unionize, work to join a union if you can. Get your friends together, join a union, create a union. If you have the option, it is worth doing, even if it seems like it sucks that extra money's coming out of your paycheck. Remember, big picture. If you can do it, do it.
And I think today's world, not only is it ripe for needing unions, but it's also ripe for the possibility of unions, because one of the biggest things with multinational corporations is that they have a lot of stores and they have their employees do a lot of just menial same tasks. And so every time you have a Target, a Walmart, a Starbucks, they're all doing the same thing at different locations. That's the perfect recipe for a union.
Absolutely.
You have so many people that are doing the exact same work. It's not like
really easy to.
It's not like you have
categorize that as this is this type of work. It should be treated under these conditions for a union, and I think that's great. Unfortunately, I'm about done with my second beer, and that means we have been going at this a little too long.
Something else.
But I love these conversations, and I appreciate you, Chris, literally flying in to come do this for our piddly little podcast.
Yeah,
so.
I have the luxury of being able to catch a ride on an airplane for the low cost of existing. So super happy.
But still also time on your day, and
but also a benefit from my union.
Yeah, absolutely.
There you go.
And with that, we will see you next time. Thank you guys for continuing to stick with us through the Let the Meat Toast podcast. We're working on making it better. Hopefully every episode you see Chris did a whole lot of effort on helping put this all together. for us today, and we appreciate him. Thank you, Taylor, and we will see you guys next time.
Adios.